A fiery clash erupts in the Supreme Court as Judge John Roberts locks horns with Reporter Jasmine Crockett, a legal prodigy, in a battle over free speech that could reshape justice. Tensions boil, secrets unravel, and the nation watches. The hallowed chambers of the Supreme Court buzzed with an electric undercurrent, the kind that precedes a storm. Reporters packed the galleries, their pens poised, as television cameras trained on the central figures. Chief Justice John Roberts, his steely gaze fixed, and Representative Jasmine Crockett, the Texas congresswoman whose meteoric rise had made her a polarizing figure. The case before them was a powder keg. Crockett stood accused of inciting unrest through a series of viral speeches defending voting rights, speeches that critics claimed veered into dangerous territory. The Department of Justice, under pressure from conservative lawmakers, had charged her with violating federal laws against incitement, a move many saw as a politically motivated attempt to silence a vocal critic of electoral restrictions. Crockett's presence in the courtroom was no accident. Her fiery rhetoric, often delivered on the House floor or at packed rallies, had galvanized a movement but also drawn the ire of powerful figures. Her speeches, laced with sharp critiques of voter suppression, laws had sparked protests across the country, some of which turned chaotic. The government argued that her words knowingly fanned the flames, pointing to a riot in Atlanta where her name was chanted. Crockett, however, maintained her innocence, framing the case as an assault on free speech itself. The stakes were astronomical. A conviction could end her career and set a precedent for criminalizing political dissent. John Roberts, presiding over the case, was no neutral arbiter in the eyes of Crockett's supporters. Known for his measured conservatism, he had faced scrutiny for rulings that critics argued favored entrenched power. To them, Roberts embodied the establishment, and his decision to personally question Crockett during oral arguments raised eyebrows. Whispers circulated that he saw her as a disruptor, a politician whose legal acumen, honed at Southern University Law Center and sharpened in Congress, threatened the court's authority. His challenge was clear: to expose any weakness in her. Defense: to test whether her brilliance was substance or show. As Crockett rose to address the court, her posture was defiant, her voice steady. "This case isn't about one riot," she began, her eyes sweeping the justices. "It's about whether speaking truth to power is a crime in America." The gallery murmured, and Roberts leaned forward, his expression unreadable. He interrupted, his tone sharp. "Representative Crockett, are you suggesting that your words bear no responsibility for the violence that followed?" The question hung like a guillotine. Crockett didn't flinch. "I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that my words were a call for justice, not chaos. The responsibility lies with those who twist them." The exchange set the tone. Roberts pressed harder, probing her intent, her knowledge of the protest's volatility. Each question was a scalpel, designed to dissect her argument. Yet Crockett parried with precision, citing case law, Brandenburg versus Ohio, Hess versus Indiana, her voice rising with conviction. The other justices scribbled notes, some visibly intrigued, others skeptical. The courtroom crackled with tension as Roberts leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You speak of truth," he said, "but truth doesn't absolve recklessness. How do you reconcile that?" Crockett's response was a masterstroke. She recounted her upbringing in St. Louis, where systemic inequities shaped her worldview. "I learned early that silence is complicity," she said. "My speeches weren't reckless, they were necessary." The gallery erupted in murmurs, forcing the bailiff to call for order. Roberts' face betrayed a flicker of surprise, but he quickly regained composure. He shifted tactics, questioning her legal interpretation of imminent lawless action, the standard for incitement. Crockett countered with a deft analysis, weaving constitutional theory with real-world context. As the session neared its close, Roberts delivered a final salvo. "Representative, your eloquence is noted, but the law demands accountability. Are You prepared for its judgment? Crockett met his gaze, unflinching. I'm prepared, Your Honor, to defend my rights, and the rights of every American, to speak freely. The gavel fell, and the room held its breath. Outside, protesters chanted her name, while pundits on cable news dissected the clash. Something bigger was brewing, and Crockett's next move would light the fuse. The Supreme Court chamber pulsed, with unspoken stakes as the gavel's echo faded. Jasmine Crockett's defiant words lingered, a challenge to John Roberts's authority that reverberated beyond the marble walls. The Chief Justice's face was a mask, but his eyes betrayed a glint of irritation. He had expected to unsettle her, to expose a crack in her armor, but Crockett's command of the law and her unyielding resolve had turned the tables. The gallery buzzed with whispers, reporters scribbling furiously, sensing a story that could redefine the court's legacy. Outside, the chants of "Jasmine, Jasmine" grew louder, a rhythmic pulse of unrest that seeped into the room. As the court reconvened after a brief recess, the tension was palpable. Roberts, now flanked by the other justices, seemed determined to regain control. The day's session focused on the prosecution's evidence, recordings of Crockett's speeches, social media posts from protesters, and police reports from the Atlanta riot. The government's attorney, a seasoned litigator named Margaret Hensley, presented a damning narrative. Representative Crockett's words weren't just passionate, Hensley argued, her voice clipped. They were a calculated incitement, designed to provoke chaos under the guise of activism. She played a clip of Crockett at a rally, her voice soaring, "If they lock us out of the ballot box, we'll tear down the walls." The crowd's roar in the video was deafening, and Hensley paused it, letting the sound linger. Crockett's legal team, led by veteran civil rights attorney Marcus Tate, countered with a motion to contextualize the speech. Tate argued that Crockett's words were metaphorical, a call for democratic reform, not violence. But Roberts cut him off, his tone icy. "Mr. Tate, we're not here to debate metaphors. We're here to determine if your client's rhetoric crossed a legal line." The rebuke stung, and Tate sat down, his jaw tight. Roberts then turned to Crockett, who had been granted permission to speak on her own behalf. "Representative," he said, "you've heard the evidence. Do you dispute that your words inspired the violence in Atlanta?" Crockett rose, her presence commanding. "I dispute the framing, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "My words inspired hope, not harm. The violence came from those who fear change, not from those who seek it." The gallery stirred, and Robert's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order!" he snapped, his patience fraying. He leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. "You speak of hope, but the law doesn't bend for intent alone. Your speeches led to bloodshed. How do you answer that?" The question was a trap, and Crockett knew it. She took a breath, her mind racing through legal precedents. "Your Honor, Brandenburg versus Ohio sets the standard. Speech is protected unless it intends and is likely to produce imminent lawless action. My speeches called for voting, not violence. The prosecution hasn't proven intent." Her response was surgical, and several justices nodded, their pens moving. Justice Sonia Sotomayor interjected, her tone probing but less hostile. "Representative, how do you distinguish your rhetoric from, say, the incitement in Schenck versus United States?" Crockett seized the opening, dissecting Schenck with a clarity that left the room rapt. Even Roberts seemed momentarily caught off guard. But the Chief Justice wasn't done. He shifted to a new line of attack, questioning Crockett's role as a public figure. "You're not just a citizen, Representative. You're a leader with a platform. Doesn't that carry a higher responsibility to temper your words?" The question was laced with condescension, as if Crockett's passion were a liability. She didn't hesitate. "With respect, Your Honor, leadership demands truth, not timidity. If I tempered my words, I'd be betraying the people I serve. The room erupted in murmurs, and Robert's face tightened. He pressed further, citing her social media posts, which had gone viral before the riots. You retweeted calls for revolution, he said. Is that responsible leadership? Crockett's eyes flashed. I retweeted a constituent's cry for justice, not a call to arms. Context matters, Your Honor. The exchange was a duel, each thrust and parry, drawing gasps from the gallery. As the session wound down, Roberts delivered a pointed remark. Context may matter, Representative, but consequences define this case. We'll see if your defense holds. The gavel fell, and Crockett's gaze didn't waver. Outside, the protests swelled, and a leaked clip of the exchange went viral, igniting a firestorm. The nation was dividing, and Crockett's next stand would tip the scales. The Supreme Court's marble halls seemed to hum with the weight of the moment, as if the walls themselves absorbed the clash between Jasmine Crockett and John Roberts. The leaked clip of their latest exchange had exploded online, splintering public opinion. Supporters hailed Crockett as a fearless defender of free speech. Detractors branded her a reckless instigator. Protests outside grew chaotic, with police, barricades straining against the crowd. Inside the courtroom was a pressure cooker, every glance and gesture charged with intent. Roberts, his authority challenged, seemed more resolute than ever to pin Crockett down, while she stood unbowed, her legal acumen a shield against his probing. As the third day of arguments began, the focus shifted to witness testimony, a phase the prosecution hoped would cement their case. Margaret Hensley, the government's attorney, called a police captain from Atlanta, Daniel Ortiz, who had been on duty during the riot. Ortiz, grizzled and stern, described the chaos: burning cars, shattered storefronts, and chants of Crockett's name. Her words were everywhere, he testified, his voice heavy. The crowd was chanting, "Tear down the walls," quoting her speech. It felt like a rallying cry. Hensley pressed him. In your professional opinion, did Representative Crockett's rhetoric contribute to the violence? Ortiz nodded. Absolutely. Her words lit the match. Crockett's attorney, Marcus Tate, rose for cross-examination, his demeanor calm but incisive. He challenged Ortiz's interpretation, eliciting that the riot had multiple triggers, including a controversial voter ID law passed days earlier. Isn't it true, Tate asked, that the crowd was already volatile before my client's speech was even referenced? Ortiz hesitated, then admitted, there were other factors, yes. Tate's questions chipped away at the narrative, but Roberts intervened, his tone sharp. Mr. Tate, let's not stray from the issue. The question is your client's role, not the city's politics. The gallery tensed, sensing Roberts' impatience. Crockett, given leave to question the witness herself, seized the moment. Captain Ortiz, she began, her voice steady. Did you hear my full speech, or just the snippet played here? Ortiz frowned. Just the clip. Crockett nodded, turning to the justices. Then let me provide context. My speech was, about dismantling barriers to voting, not buildings. The prosecution cherry-picked a soundbite. She requested to play the full recording, and after a tense pause, Roberts allowed it. The courtroom listened as Crockett's voice filled the space, passionate but precise, calling for civic action, not violence. The contrast was stark, and murmurs rippled through the gallery. Roberts, undeterred, shifted the session's focus to legal arguments, zeroing in on Crockett's defense. Representative, he said, his voice like a blade, you claim your speech was protected, but the Brandenburg Standard requires no likelihood of imminent harm. A riot followed your words. How do you square that? Crockett met his gaze, unflinching. Your Honor, the riot was hours later, not imminent. Brandenburg protects speech unless it's a direct call to violence. My call was to vote, not to burn. Her response was a masterclass, weaving precedent with fact, and Justice Kagan scribbled furiously, her expression intrigued. But Roberts pressed harder, his questions relentless. "You knew your audience was angry," he said. "Didn't you foresee the risk?" The accusation hung heavy, and Crockett's jaw tightened. "I foresaw the risk of silence, Your Honor. Silence in the face of injustice breeds worse consequences than speech." The gallery erupted, forcing a gavel's crack. Roberts' face was stone, but a flicker of frustration crossed it. He pivoted, questioning her social media activity again. "You amplified calls for revolution," he said. "That's not voting. That's provocation." Crockett countered, "Revolution, Your Honor, can mean change at the ballot box. The First Amendment doesn't punish metaphors." The session's final moments were electric. Roberts, sensing the tide of argument shifting, issued a challenge. "Representative, you speak of freedom, but freedom isn't absolute when it endangers lives. Can you prove your words didn't cross that line?" Crockett's response was measured but fierce. "I can prove the law is on my side, Your Honor. The question is whether this court will uphold it." The gavel fell, and the room held its breath. Outside, the protests roared louder, and a new hashtag, Sechan Crockett vs. Roberts, trended worldwide. The battle was far from over, and Crockett's next move would shake the foundations. The Supreme Court chamber crackled with unresolved tension, the air thick with the aftershocks of Jasmine Crockett's bold defiance. Her parting words to John Roberts had landed like a gauntlet, challenging not just the Chief Justice, but the institution he represented. The Chagwash Crockett vs. Roberts hashtag was a wildfire online, with viral clips of their clashes fueling debates on free speech, power, and justice. Outside, protesters clashed with police, their signs proclaiming "words aren't crimes" alongside Crockett's face. Inside, the justices prepared for the final day of arguments, and Roberts' steely demeanor signaled he was far from conceding the field. Crockett, undaunted, was ready to escalate the fight. As the session opened, the prosecution, led by Margaret Hensley, doubled down. Sensing the case slipping, Hensley introduced a surprise witness, a former aide to Crockett, Ethan Waller, who claimed insider knowledge of her intent. Waller, nervous under the courtroom's glare, testified that Crockett had privately expressed concern about her speeches going too far, but chose to keep the pressure on for political gain. "She knew the crowds were volatile," he said, his voice shaky. "She wanted to harness that energy." The accusation was a bombshell, and the gallery gasped. Hensley's eyes gleamed as she turned to the justices. "This proves intent, Your Honors. Representative Crockett knowingly risked violence." Marcus Tate, Crockett's attorney, leapt to his feet, objecting to the witness's credibility. "Mr. Waller was fired for misconduct," Tate argued. "This is a vendetta, not evidence." Roberts, his expression unreadable, allowed the testimony, but permitted cross-examination. Crockett, granted leave to question Waller herself, approached with a predator's calm. "Mr. Waller," she began, her voice cutting, "did I ever instruct you to plan or encourage violence?" Waller squirmed. "No, but you knew the risks." Crockett pounced. "So you're speculating, not testifying. And isn't it true you were let go for leaking confidential emails?" Waller's silence was damning, and the gallery buzzed as Tate moved to strike the testimony. Roberts, after a tense pause, allowed it to stand, but his tone was curt. "Move on, Representative." The session shifted to closing arguments, and Roberts turned his focus to Crockett's legal defense. "Representative," he said, his voice a controlled burn, "you've argued Brandenburg protects your speech. But the standard hinges on intent and likelihood. Your aide's testimony suggests you anticipated harm. How do you refute that?" The question was a minefield, and Crockett knew one misstep could doom her. She stood, her gaze locked on Roberts. "Your Honor, Mr. Waller's claims are unproven and biased. My intent was to mobilize voters, not mobs. The prosecution has no evidence of direct incitement, only conjecture. Her words were a tightrope walk, blending legal precision with moral force, and Justice Gorsuch leaned forward, scribbling notes. Roberts wasn't satisfied. He pressed her on the broader implications. Your rhetoric, Representative, has divided the nation. If we protect it, what stops others from pushing the same line, risking more chaos? The question was less about law than philosophy, a challenge to her very existence as a provocateur. Crockett's response was electric. Your Honor, the First Amendment exists for the uncomfortable, not the tame. If we criminalize passion, we silence dissent. That's the real chaos. The gallery erupted, and Roberts' gavel slammed twice, to restore order. His eyes narrowed, and he fired back. Passion doesn't absolve recklessness. You've yet to prove your words didn't tip the scale toward violence. The confrontation reached a fever pitch as Crockett countered with a daring move. She cited a lesser-known case, Falwell versus Flint, where provocative speech was upheld despite public outcry. The law protects even the offensive, Your Honor, she said. My words were a cry for justice, not a call to arms. The other justices exchanged glances, some visibly swayed. Roberts, however, remained a wall. We'll see if the law agrees with your interpretation, he said, his tone laced with skepticism. As the session closed, he issued a final barb. Representative, your defense is bold, but the court weighs facts, not feelings. Prepare for our ruling. The gavel fell, and the room held its breath. Outside, the protests reached a boiling point, and a leaked audio of Waller's testimony sparked outrage. The nation was on edge, and Crockett's final stand loomed. The Supreme Court chamber was a crucible of anticipation. The weight of Jasmine Crockett's final stand against John Roberts hanging like smoke in the air. His parting words, dismissing her defense as driven by feelings rather than facts, had stung, but Crockett's resolve was ironclad. The nation was fracturing, with protests outside the court swelling into a sea of banners and chants, fueled by the leaked audio of Ethan Waller's shaky testimony. Social media was a battlefield. Are Crockett vs. Roberts, trending alongside fiery debates over free speech and accountability. As the court prepared to deliver its ruling, every eye was on Crockett, whose legal brilliance had turned a trial into a referendum on justice itself. The session opened with a hush, the justices filing in, their faces unreadable. Roberts, presiding with an air of unyielding authority, called the court to order. The gallery was packed, reporters poised, cameras rolling. Outside, police sirens wailed as clashes intensified. Roberts began reading the majority opinion, his voice steady but edged with gravitas. The question before us, he said, is whether Representative Crockett's speech crossed the line into unprotected incitement under Brandenburg versus Ohio. The standard is clear. Speech must intend and be likely to produce imminent lawless action. The room held its breath as he outlined the case's facts, the Atlanta riot, Crockett's speeches, the prosecution's evidence. Crockett sat motionless, her eyes locked on Roberts. Her attorney, Marcus Tate, whispered something, but she didn't respond. Roberts continued, his tone measured. The prosecution argues that Representative Crockett's rhetoric, particularly her call to tear down the walls, directly incited violence. They point to the testimony of her former aide, Mr. Waller, suggesting she foresaw harm. A murmur rippled through the gallery and Crockett's jaw tightened. Roberts paused, his gaze sweeping the room. However, he said, the defense has demonstrated that the speech, in its full context, was a call for democratic action, not violence. The riot occurred hours later, undermining claims of imminence. The shift in his words sent a jolt through the courtroom. Justice Sotomayor nodded slightly, her pen still. Roberts pressed on. The First Amendment protects even provocative speech, as seen in precedents like Falwell versus Flint. Mr. Waller's testimony, while troubling, lacks corroboration and is tainted by personal bias. Crockett's eyes widened, a flicker of hope, breaking through her stoic facade. Roberts' voice grew firmer. This court finds that the government has not met its burden. Representative Crockett's speech, while impassioned, does not constitute incitement under Brandenburg. The charges are dismissed. The gallery erupted, cheers mingling with gasps. Crockett exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. Tate clasped her hand, his face beaming. But Roberts wasn't done. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Crockett. "Representative," he said, his tone stern, "this ruling affirms your rights, but it does not absolve you of responsibility. Words carry weight. Use them wisely." The rebuke was a final jab, a reminder of his skepticism, but Crockett met his gaze with quiet defiance. "I will, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear. "I'll use them to fight for justice." As the gavel fell, the courtroom dissolved into chaos. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Outside, the protests turned jubilant. Crockett's name chanted like a victory cry. Cable news exploded, pundits dissecting the ruling's implications. Some hailed it as a triumph for free speech. Others warned it emboldened reckless rhetoric. The decision sparked fierce debate, with legal scholars questioning whether the court had lowered the bar for incitement or reaffirmed constitutional protections. Critics of Roberts accused him of bowing to public pressure. Supporters praised his restraint. Crockett, meanwhile, emerged as a lightning rod, her victory cementing her as a legal and political force. In the days that followed, Crockett addressed a massive rally, her voice soaring. "This isn't just my win," she declared. "It's a win for every voice they try to silence." The crowd roared, but the nation remained divided, the ruling fueling calls for legal reform on both sides. Crockett's clash with Roberts had exposed the fault lines of the justice system, leaving a legacy of debate and defiance. As she walked away from the court, her head high, one truth was clear. Her words had not only won her freedom, but reshaped the conversation, a triumph that echoed far beyond the marble halls.